Well, when you put it that way, I think it's not different from Christianity 101 and perhaps Islam 101.
Amen.
Because if you look at what happened to Christianity, particularly, I guess, after the Council of Nicaea and the Romans took it over, it was a way of control and a hierarchical system that if you follow the system, well, you would have entrance to heaven. And whatever happened in heaven, it would be wonderful and so on and so forth. But, you may have to pay a price while you're here on earth. But certainly the priests and the hierarchy could absolve you of sins, etc., etc. All you had to do was follow what they said. And like you said, their commandments and their rituals and their observances and things that you can do on Friday and types of food that you can eat, and Friday is fish day or whatever it is, and and your prayers and so on and so forth. So it becomes a control system, and maybe what you're saying is that all religion is like that. Religion, when it gets away from its spirituality and its origins, becomes something very controlling, representing a particular cultural experience and the propagation of that culture.
And also in the hands of nationalists who are following it because they are nationalists. It enables them to fight their enemies and survive surrounded by their enemies. Do you see? And this is one of the lessons that, to a certain extent, your father was teaching about how we should be approaching our religion. So in other words, a lot of Black scholars, we talk about the rightness or wrongness of the facts, the rightness or wrongness of the spirituality and what the lessons originally meant. But in the hands of other people, they've been able to turn essentially our ideas into weapons of war and weapons of power.
If you look at it sort of from the modern perspective, with sort of retrospectroscope, we like to say that history is the lens through which we look at the future, but maybe history is also the lens through which we look at the past, to really gain an understanding of the past. And I think we can see, we can trace back the original spiritual ideas that were the basis of all of these religions. But they have been shaped by the historical and cultural experience of different people who have manipulated the original spirituality in lots of different ways, largely not only to benefit themselves, but for them to survive, even in hostile environments. And then also to allow them to conquer other people who do not accept their beliefs and are therefore heathens or are therefore the enemy. So religion has been used as a weapon of survival and a weapon of destruction of other people, and shall we say, taking over their space. If we look at that whole business of the slave trade and colonialism, certainly in terms of Europe, this is exactly what happened. I mean, the armies went in first and killed certain people, and then the priests went in next, or the ministers, what have you, and changed the religious basis of the people, so that they were disconnected from their religious system, which would have been their survival kit, as you kind of called it. I think what we were saying. Your religion is your survival kit in terms of your culture and your self-expression and how you interact with different groups, tribes, or nations, or what have you. Now, when your survival kit is taken away, you're at the mercy of these new people who are coming in and they're not giving you a survival kit. They're telling you to come in under their tents. So,
Yeah.
so now you have no way to combat them because
Yeah.
your survival kit is lost, and you've become caught up into their way of living and their gods and their religion and their way to exist in the world. And you're like, it's like you no longer exist.
And let me throw in something else, sir. And then what then happens as well is what happens when you can use certain ideas from the Tanakh against other people specifically. So let me give you an example. When the commandment, the mitzvah, thou shalt have no other gods but me, that's, if you like, the belief of God's talking to the Israelite people or the Jewish people, Hebrew people, whatever. Does that make sense? Now, if we change the context, so it now becomes God talking to everybody, that now means if you don't worship the same God that's in the Tanakh, you are now committing sin, and I now have the right to convert you or kill you or label you a pagan, label you a heathen. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so once that is, you can be labeled a pagan, Arabic version of it, kafir. Mm-hmm. They can now kill you, enslave you, and so on, so on, and so forth. And even though you didn't consent to the "thou shalt have no other gods but me," you weren't asked, you know. Do you see? And so something that was, if you like, between God and the Jewish people now becomes between God and everybody, and that everybody says that there's only one right way to do it, a million wrong ways to do it. And if you're part of that million wrong ways to do it, then you can be converted, killed, or enslaved. And that's the reason why the commandments, certainly the Christian version of it, the 10 Commandments, the Jewish version 613, that's the reason why they've always held on to that, because they can use it as a weapon. And that's why being able to call people a pagan, a heathen, or a kafir is such a powerful thing, because now your liberty's on the line once they've called you that. Greetings. My name is Robin Walker. I'm also known as the Black History Man. I'm perhaps best known for my 2006 book, When We Ruled. Based on this book, I'm launching a new online history course aimed at you, the adults. You could be a parent, you could be a teacher, a mechanic, cleaner, professionals, care workers, security guards, taxi drivers, kitchen workers, entrepreneurs, tech heads, lawyers, all of you. We want people from all over the world to be empowered by our content. We want you to gain mastery over your history and heritage. And you can do this by subscribing to our course. Click on the link to get this powerful, life-changing material.
In some sense, in terms of, you know, how we're discussing it now, and your perspective is very interesting, in that religion really becomes a weapon, as we mentioned, something of a survival kit initially, but certainly as a way to maneuver in the world and to shake the world in terms of your own perspective. So that you're always, shall we say, dominant, whether it's by virtue of conversion or liquidation or any other means. I'm kind of wondering, you know, if we look at Christianity, because in some sense, Christianity came out of Judaism. And in some sense, I think both Judaism and Christianity came out of the same source, which is Egyptian Kemetic spirituality in terms of their understanding. And going back to the Essenes, because I think they were perhaps a Jewish sect, but but the Gnostic groups, which I think was carrying on the Kemetic tradition, and then there was the Orthodox side of it, which was the religious or the Jewish side, and there was this more pure spiritual side, which are the Essenes, I guess, Essenes, however it's pronounced. And out of this came sort of the story of Jesus, or that's one a way in which it's thought of, that Jesus may have been a Gnostic, because I think a book of Jesus has been found, or Gospel of Jesus has been found. I don't know if you're, sort of the Gospel of Thomas, but in there's a lot of sayings of Jesus. And it's considered that this Jesus now was a Gnostic, part of the Essenes group, and that they were a Jewish group, which again would be sort of the Exodus, if you will, into Palestine, from Egypt. And then you have that becoming distorted over time, and again dealing perhaps with the Nicene Creed, and then the rewriting of so much of early Christianity in terms of the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and how they were reinterpreted in terms of telling the story. Because if you look at so much of it, and you know the work of Charles Finch, and you can probably go over that so much of it points to the story of Jesus as the Christ being Horus, which is the Egyptian deity, and this is probably what the Essenes were expressing in terms of their understanding of their own spirituality. And then they would have the sayings of Jesus would be similar to the sayings of Horus, which we have also in the hieroglyphics that have come down to us. And then, of course, this then gets distorted because it became spiritual. There was a spiritual aspect of, shall we say, the Jewish religion, if you will, that aspect of it, because they were against the Pharisees during that period of time, trying to reorganize Jewish religion away from the orthodoxy and the ritual that it had become, and wanting it to be more of a spiritual thing. And this aspect of it then, shall we say, became the basis of Christianity. But then this was also subverted later on, by the Romans.
Yeah, well said, sir. Essentially, the problem that early Christianity had is that not enough was known about the Jesus figure. If he existed, if you were to put all the known facts, if I can use the word known in inverted commas, there isn't really that much to go on. I think the main theory is that his ministry lasted 3.5 years or something like that. You can correct me. And so there isn't much that to go on. And when we look at his mystical birth, it looks just like the mystical birth of Horus and many of the other deities where, the Immaculate Conception, him disappearing into the temple age 12, coming out the age of 30. A lot of it is looking just like these types of traditions. And what's more, did you know that Dr. Martin Luther King also pointed this out?
No, I didn't. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
He was aware of this in terms of the source of Christianity.
Yeah, Dr. King was obviously a Bible scholar.
Yes.
And during his student years, he wrote a paper where he's describing essentially the mystical religions during the time of allegedly Jesus, such as the Mithraic one, the Egyptian one, And he says that in all the major essentials, these mystical religions were actually very, very similar to each other. And essentially, it was Christianity was the one that blew up, but any of the others could have blown up too. So there is a student article by Dr. King, and I do actually quote that student article in my book. I did a book called Blacks and Religion, Volume 2, where I quote Dr. King, of all people, are pointing this out. So here's the thing, here's the thing. Because there is so little historic fact about Jesus, you cannot actually build a religion on just the teachings of Jesus. Why? Because did he get married? Because there's a big question mark over whether he did or not. How are men supposed to relate to women? The Christians don't have an answer. When it comes to all the other aspects of life, the Christians don't actually have an answer. So a lot of Christianity then had to be shaped by St. Paul, and a lot of Christianity had to be shaped by the Tanakh, which is now being called the Old Testament. That's why they held on to the Old Testament, because in the hands of the Roman Empire, they could use the commandments to mash up everybody else's religion by being able to call them pagans and heathens. Thou shalt have no other gods but me. You see, if you're taking the teachings as attributed to Jesus, you couldn't come to that conclusion. By himself, he was a man of peace and righteousness. But you can't build a religion just around that. Do you see? That's why they had to keep the Old Testament, so that they could keep the muscularity and use that muscularity against their enemies. And consequently, they now have religious justification to fight their enemies. And that's why you would hold on to the Old Testament. And then a lot of the other aspects of family building and so on had to come from St. Paul. And St. Paul, I gather, was Egyptian.
As a thank you for visiting our website, we are giving you a free copy of our exclusive 100 Black History Facts, which is in fact a taster of our course content. Make sure you leave your email address and we will send it right to you. We hope it inspires you to dig deeper into your history and heritage.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And also there's a passage where somebody else refers to St. Paul and refers to him as that Egyptian.
Interesting. Yeah. I know that he was how should I put it, a spiritual person, in that he shaped a lot of Christianity with his epistles to the Corinthians and the Galatians and so on and so forth. And of course, he didn't know Jesus by his own admission. He only knew Jesus through a mystical experience.
Yeah.
And this was his relationship then with Christianity. I think he was on the road to Damascus, if I remember my Sunday school stuff, which I haven't revisited, that he had this experience of meeting this mystical Christ. So he was expressing a mystical Christus, which is what the original Egyptian understanding was, the Karas, the anointed one, who is Heru, who was resurrected his father, which is the spiritual essence or his soul. So I've always looked at Paul from that perspective, that he was a Christian in that sense, more so than these other folks who was taking Jesus as a historical person. He saw Jesus as a mystical person, entity. Therefore, he was always trying to express this mystical persona through himself, which was the original understanding or teaching, that the Christ was, each of us had to be this Christ, which was the perfection of ourselves. And then, of course, you go back to that whole scene of the weighing of the heart against the feather, and the whole concept of Ma'at and before the 42 gods in Ausar's chamber, and Heru sitting on his throne, etc., etc. Which is the Egyptian, version of somebody who has lived that spiritual life fully, and therefore can approach, shall we say, the other side. At the time of physical death, he can approach the other side and say, I have not done this, I have not done that, I have not done that, and so on and so forth. And my conscience is clear, the conscience being the heart, and it's being weighed against the feather. I mean, that's such a beautiful, concept that
and that's the thing, you see, and that's the thing. If Christianity had stayed like that, it could have been a very, very beautiful religion. But because it's in the hands of the Roman Empire trying to expand its power, it became a tool of oppression, it became a tool of violence, and as such a tool, it is responsible for the deaths of so many more people than almost any ideology that had ever come into being. Because what happened was they were able to use the Old Testament against its enemies. You've got to remember, people talk about the Roman Empire as if everybody was a Christian. You've got to remember the state religion was the worship of you've got the various deities associated with the planets, like some
Dionysus and those people.
Yeah.
Saturn and whatnot.
And so you've got to remember, all of that had to be wiped out. Then you had the elites in the Roman Empire worshipping Mithra. That had to be wiped out. And the result being that essentially a huge amount of forced conversions, and then with it, a huge amount of death, took place all the way across the Roman Empire. And then, of course, you've got to remember, the Romans conquered North Africa. Yeah. And they were therefore doing that to us as well. Do you see? And how they could justify that is by adding to, if you like, the beautiful side of what was in Christianity to the muscular and, can I say, violent side of what, and they were able to put the two together.